Welcome to NBC10 at Issue. I'm NBC10's Erin Coleman. Anger and frustration from protesters all over the country and right here in our area. They are clear about what they want, change. But what kind of change is most effective, and where do we start?
With me this morning, Donavan West. He is the president and CEO of the African American Chamber of Commerce of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. We also have Dion Lassiter, the executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And we've got Margaret Hagerman, an assistant professor of sociology at Mississippi State University. She's done extensive research on white privilege and wrote the book, White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. Thank you all so much for being here with us this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Good morning. All right, so let's get right in. You know, we have seen tens of thousands of people all over the country, all over the world, protesting, taking their concerns to the streets. What do we need to do now? What is the next step to move beyond the protests, beyond the committees, beyond the conversation, to enact real, tangible change here?
We need to move beyond the event to making it a way of life. You know, that's what I think is the number one thing we have to be really concerned about, is that we've often gotten too far into this, you know, hashtag protests, and then, you know, we kind of sit and wait to some extent for the next big event to participate in. And I think in many ways, there are certain things that we need to do from an advocacy standpoint that become a way of life. You know, even as we talk about other events that are happening this year with the census and, you know, with the elections, you know, there are things that we can do in between these milestone events that can really contribute a long way to establishing more of a registered voice and making sure that we move beyond this emotional response, if you will, to thinking more strategically and consistently.
For me, I would love to see a report similar to the report that came out with the Kerner Commission. We can entitle this moment that we find ourselves in almost the same thing, the Kerner Commission revisited in the 21st century. I think we also have to have frank conversations on white violence and white racism in our democracy. These conversations have to include how oftentimes whiteness provides protection for the mob and does nothing for those who get mobbed. We need to also look at criminal justice reform, where these incidents of police brutality occur and some of these officers are able to get off with impunity, that we need a special prosecution. And for me, I would love for that to be the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division.
You know, some have said that the passion, the momentum, I mean, that's what we have right now. The change needs to be immediate. So how do you make that change now, not 3 months from now, 3 years from now? You know, how do you make it happen right away while everything is still fresh?
I think a good example of that is what we saw with the Rizzo statue. You know, you saw an opportunity where instead of it, you know, the initial response was, oh, we're going to remove it in 2 months. And then all of a sudden you saw an adjustment where it was removed overnight pretty much. I think that, you know, when you have gestures like that, that shows that you acknowledge and that you're listening to what the people are requesting, I think that buys you some time when it comes to other things, as Chad mentioned, in terms of reform that may take a little bit longer when you start to get into, you know, what specific policies need to be eliminated and then what policies need to be introduced to the system. You know, that may take a little bit longer, but in terms of responding to the immediate needs of the people, I think gestures like that go a long way. Also, in terms of the response to, you know, when we're talking about the Floyd incident, you know, when you know, instead of, you know, pausing for a moment and saying, well, let's look at all the evidence, and when you see this outpour of information, video from all angles, you know, not taking, you know, several days to respond, but to respond in a more, you know, prompt, quick way, I think demonstrates the priority that the people that are protesting need to be treated. You know, they need to understand that they are a priority. And so how quickly you respond by way of taking certain gestures that I would say that even in the face of, making sure that someone gets their right time in court and that things are processed, there are still things that you can do that demonstrate accountability. And for police officers, when you have a higher level of expectation from those that are in service, then there should be higher standards in terms of, a prompt response from their management in terms of when they do wrong.
Right. Immediate being the key here. Margaret, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your book and the research that you have done. You really explore how ideas of race develop in white children. Talk a little bit about what you found.
So what I found is that for the kids in my book, their parents' decisions mattered a lot more for how they thought about race than what their parents said. And so in this moment, I'm seeing so much, so many articles and so many, pieces coming out that they're really urging white parents to talk to their kids about race. But what I find is that actually their actions are really what matter. So I think that if we're going to move beyond this moment and think about real changes, of course, the large, big, broad, systemic changes are important, but I also think that white parents have a role to play at the level of parenting, the decisions they make about where to live, the schools they send their kids to, the way they advocate for their children at the expense of other kids. I think that there's a lot that parents can do beyond just talk about race to their children, and that's important.
You talk a lot about white privilege in your book as well. If we're talking about, as kids here, if it's so ingrained in someone, how do you change that? If you have these ideas when you were, a young child, how do you really change that decades later?
It's a really important question, and there's some scholarship that shows that even like late adolescence, typical, kind of traditional college-age students, it's already really difficult to change people's perspectives and their racial ideologies.
Wow.
So that's why I think we have to start when kids are young. The kids in my book are in middle school, and they already have all kinds of ideas about race. They're not colorblind, quote unquote. They're not, unaware of what's going on around them. And so it's really important that we start young.
Well, I think it does definitely start with the racial socialization process of when young individuals are being groomed by their parents into a culture of not just, white race neutral, but also the whole aspect of just white supremacy. And parents sometimes engage in these behaviors. A great book by Beverly Tatum is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria Table? But the challenges that we have in our democracy are tied to institutions, the systemic and structural oppression, the educational apartheid, the economic injustice, the environmental racism. And so when you just look at police departments, oftentimes they tend to trend in the direction of diversity training. It really needs to be anti-racism training. When you see a person like Donavan and you see a person like myself, because of our stature, even if our stature wasn't big black men, the stereotype should not be to see us from a dehumanizing standpoint. When you look at the whole killing of George Floyd, he's a human being. The police officer is also a human being, but the police officer, from a lens of white supremacy, implicit, explicit bias, did not see George Floyd as a human being. He saw him as a non-person, non-entity, and got enjoyment out of actually having his knee on his neck. When the individual says, "I can't breathe," he's yelling for his mother, and then he invokes, "I don't want to die." At some point, your humanity as an officer should have stopped that and saw the humanity of this individual saying, "I can't breathe, mama, I don't want to die." But what we have is we have the psyche of white supremacy that often sees black bodies as suspicious and under surveillance, and then we're dehumanized. And that's why we have this anthology of police brutality that historically we can track from the overseer on the plantation to officers in our communities as an occupying terroristic force at times, not all officers.
Let's talk a little bit about police and policy. Earlier this week, former President Barack Obama, he had a virtual town hall calling for every mayor in this country to pursue a list of police reforms. And he was specific about these things. No more shooting at moving vehicles. Let's, use of force, chokeholds, that kind of thing. Is that a concrete thing also that can help the relationship between police and the community when we have a larger conversation about this?
Removing these types of gestures that are seen as options, there's something wrong, extremely wrong with just looking at the option of chokeholds or the option of shooting at a moving car. the option of using, this type of force versus, now that at the point where you have control of this individual, why are you not just making sure that they are in the, the police car or van or whatever may be the case?
I think that one of the things that's really important is that we teach kids about just what we were talking about, the system of white supremacy, and the fact that racism is not simply something that happens at the individual level, although it does, but it also happens at the institutional level, the interpersonal level, all these different levels, and how they connect. And understanding the history of racism in America and the legacy of white supremacy is really important for young people too.
And I would just end by saying I believe this is a unifying moment, a moment where we can do what Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Yahshua Heschel termed the beloved community, where we can do coalition building on all sides of the color line, all sides of the gender line. We have to also put civil disobedience, nonviolent protests into context, and we have to find a more therapeutic and cathartic way of some of the looting and some of the anger and aggression that people are displaying with, albeit I understand it in context.
Thank you all so much for being here. Donavan West, Chad, Dion, Lassiter, Margaret Hagerman, you all have been amazing, and it will be interesting to see how this all plays out and how we all move forward after what we've been seeing in the country over the past couple of days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.